Hi, this is Mahesh coming to you with another educational photography video. Reza is behind the video camera, expertly capturing the magic. This time, we'll discuss the pros and cons of using a neutral density or ND filter to capture a smooth water effect on a single long exposure, and contrast that with combining multiple shorter exposures in Photoshop without an ND filter. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. What better place to make a video on waterfall photography than Snoqualmie Falls? We're currently at the top of the waterfall. Before we hike down, I wanted to show you the equipment I'll be taking along with me. I'm using the Sony a7R III camera, and it's my intention to get wide angle and perhaps standard perspective images of the waterfall. So I'll be carrying just the 16-35 and 24-70 f2.8 G Master lenses. This is how I carry my filters. It is called a Kanga case by Polar Pro. It's compact, crush resistant, and very, very portable. In it, I have two 82mm quartz line Polar Pro ND filters, a 6-stop and a 10-stop. I also have other filters, but those are the two main filters we'll be working with today. These are amazing ND filters for waterfall. Why? Because they have circular polarizer built into them. A polarizer is extremely helpful to minimize glare from reflective surfaces such as wet rocks and plants, and that helps to bring out the richness of colors and tones. Sure, you could stack a polarizer on top of an ND filter, but then you risk vignetting artifacts. With these particular type of Polar Pro filters, you have the benefit of both on a single filter, so no vignetting problems. I also have a protective sleeve made by Peak Design for my camera lens combo as I carry it on my shoulder strap, like this. The camera is locked onto my shoulder strap with a Peak Design plate, which is over here. In the bag, I have several of these yellow absorbent cloths to wipe moisture away from the camera, including the lens. I love these things. You can get them as Costco in the automotive section, I think. They sell them in packs of 30 or so for about 20 bucks. Totally worth it. Outside of my bag is my tripod. It's made by Silky, model number W1204. Not only is it carbon fiber, therefore very sturdy and light, but it's also waterproof and made for wet conditions, including salt water. The ball head is made by Architect. Finally, here's my trusty remote shutter release. Okay, now let's hike down to the bottom of this wonderful waterfall. Well, here we are at the bottom of Snoqualmie Falls. Beautiful view here. I'm going to check out the bank and see what makes the best composition. And we'll try out our different ways of shooting waterfalls with and without ND. Alright, now we're here with this composition that I'm looking at in the viewfinder. We've got the Polar Pro 6-stop ND filter with built-in polarizer, and I want to show you the effect of the polarizer on the water surface, which is very reflective. At this point, if you look at the water surface, it's very bright. Lots of glare on the water surface. I'm going to now engage the polarizer that's built in, and then you see what happens that surface of the water. Look how much darker that water surface looks. A lot richer, a lot cleaner, a lot more pleasing. Again, disengaged, very shiny, very bright, and now engaged. Beautifully clean, dark water. Really has nice contrast with the water on the waterfall. I think this is going to go a long ways into making a wonderful shot. I'm going to take a picture now. I'm at about 8 seconds, 6 seconds, f11, ISO 100. Let's see how the shot turns out. Now we're going to take the ND filter off and take multiple bursts of images and see how that turns out once we combine them in Photoshop. Okay, now I'm going to take several images. It's about 1/6 of a second, and I'm going to just keep shooting one after the other. One disadvantage of this method already is that there's no polarizing effect, right? So we're going to get a shiny surface of the water, but let's see if we can live with that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Okay, we'll stop at 20. Not sure we need all 20 exposures, but I just would rather have more than less. And we're going to combine some of it or all of it in Photoshop later on, and then see how that combination of exposures compares to our long shutter speed image. All right, so let's now go back home and test it out. We are in Lightroom now, and I'm showing you the relevant images from today's shoot. The first two images are the long exposure images. The first one is this one with no polarizer engaged, and this one is the polarizer engaged image. In the first image, you notice the exposure time is about 2.5 seconds, and in the second image, the exposure time is about 4 seconds. That's because when the polarizer is engaged, the filter lets in less light, and therefore an increased shutter time is necessary to obtain the same amount of relative brightness. So again, here is no polarizer effect, polarizer effect. Notice that the light brightness here in the highlights is a lot harsher in the non-polarized image versus the polarized image. Also notice the glare coming off the surface here in this non-polarized image, and how that glare is minimized in the polarized image. One final thing I want you to notice is in the non-polarized image, we're not getting as much brightness from the dark areas, and therefore the richness of the greens are not quite as colorful in the non-polarized image as it is in the polarized image. It's a subtle finding, but I think it's present, and we can bring out those differences even more in post-processing. Finally, the other images are basically just the non-filtered images that I took at faster shutter speed. So these are all taken at 1/6 of a second each, and I'm going to sort of quickly go through them to show you that in fact the water is not particularly smooth or flowy. It's a little choppy. Now, can we take these sets of images from the slower shutter speed, combine them in Photoshop, and get it to look somewhat similar to our long exposure image? What I like to do is make some minor tweaks to the images in Lightroom first, and then export them out to Photoshop to do the combination. So let's go to our very first image, which is the non-polarized image. I'm going to adjust this just for satisfaction of personal taste. I'm going to decrease the highlights by going to develop and try to bring out some of the detail here if I can in the sky. I'm going to go here and say highlights, decrease, and that's actually looking pretty good. Okay, and I'm going to try to bring out some shadow detail, and that's looking pretty good. It's a little flat, but at least I'm getting some of the color out here in the rocks and the moss, some of the trees over here. I'm going to refine this a little bit more by increasing the exposure just a little bit more just in the bottom half by using the gradient tool here, and I'm going to reset everything by double clicking the effects so nothing is selected, and then maybe increase the exposure about, I don't know, 0.69, 0.68. I'm just going to put a gradual gradient here, and so I think you see the effect here pretty well. The foreground is brightened, The highlight is slightly brightened, so maybe I'll go and decrease the highlights just a tad there, so that looks pretty good. Maybe increase the contrast. See how that grabs me? And maybe the clarity just a little bit. So that is looking pretty good. So here is sort of an edit with some minor tweaks. Now this is the non-polarized image. So what did we do here? Let's go back to our history. Basically we increased the highlights or adjusted the highlights, shadows, and added a gradual filter with contrast and clarity adjustments. Well, let's try to do the same thing to our second image, which is this one right here, which is the polarized image. So just for the sake of fairness and comparison, I'm going to go back to our grid view. I'm going to take this image that I just edited, right click on it and say copy, which is going to be develop settings, copy settings, and I'm going to copy everything and make sure everything's selected. I'm just copying all the edits. Copy, and I'm going to apply that to this image. So I'm going to say right click, develop settings, paste settings. So here is unpolarized and here's polarized. So even with the same amount of editing, we notice that the greens are brighter and more luscious in the polarized image. Again, the highlight fall-offs are less conspicuous in the polarized image. The water is darker, yet you still maintain some semblance of detail in the highlights and the shadows. So these are the polarized and unpolarized images. So they look pretty good after some minor tweaks. Now let's go and edit our set of non-polarized, non-filtered images. So here they are. In fact, I took 20 of them, as you can recall from our session at the site itself. So I'm going to select them all. I'm going to right click and say edit in, open as layers in Photoshop. And here we are, the 20 images brought up as separate layers in Photoshop. So what we're going to do is vary the opacity of each layer such that each layer contributes an equal amount to the overall final layered image. So how you do that manually is basically you take the first layer and say it's 1 divided by 1, which is 100%. Second layer, it's 1 divided by 2, which is 50%. Third layer, 1 divided by 3, 33%. Fourth layer, 1 divided by 4, 25%, so on and so forth, such that the very final contribution is going to be the 20th layer, which is the very top layer. It's going to be 1 over 20, whatever that fraction happens to be. I'm going to hide all of these layers above. Here's the first image, 100%, okay? So that's already chosen. The second image, I'm going to say that, turn it on, and opacity is going to be 50%. Okay, so you notice, let's see what this is without the top layer and this is with the top layer. You can already notice there's some smoothness to the water that's developing, right? So for the third layer, I'm going to turn that on and make it 33% because it's 1 over 3. Okay, choose this one, turn it on, make it 1 over 4. So I'm going to quickly do that to the rest of the images. I'm not going to bore you with each of the calculations. Okay, here now we have the final image where each layer has contributed a certain percentage to the overall image. You notice the water looks very nice and smooth, and the highlight details are pretty well maintained, shadow details are maintained. So let's compare this to what our, let me just make this first of all as big as we can, this to our Lightroom image of the non-polarized, because that's the best comparison. Here's the non-polarized Lightroom image, and here is the final blended image. Now let's go back to Photoshop, where I'm going to show you how to automate the process of stacking those images and varying the percentages without you actually physically having to put those numbers in. And we do that by using smart objects. Okay, so let's go back to our unflattened image into the history. And then I'm going to quickly go back to a state where the mask opacity changes where not applied. So if you go through here, let's just turn them all on. They are all now at 100%. So I'm going to select the first layer, select the bottom layer, and I'm going to group them by hitting that little icon that says create a new group. So group is created. I'm going to convert this group into a smart object. For that I go to layers, smart objects, and convert to smart object. Okay, now our group has been converted to a smart object. The next step is also very simple. We go under layers, smart object, stack mode, and we choose the mean stack mode or the average stack mode. And here you go, you get the same smooth buttery effect on the water as you did with the manual approach. Now I'm going to take this image back into Lightroom and let's see how all these different effects look. So let's do the same edits here that we did previously on this image by going right-clicking on it, develop settings, paste settings. There. All right, so again, image on your left is the one that we stacked. Image on the right is the one that was already there from the overall long exposure, and the effect is relatively similar. So if you're in a bind and you don't have an ND filter or a polarizer, you can get away with shorter stacked images. In fact, the greens here have turned out a little bit better, haven't they? So now let's go back to our grid and compare all three. Here we go. The image on the left is the stacked short exposure images. The image on the right currently is the non-polarized long exposure image that we saw before. And this is the long exposure polarized image. And I think they look very similar, except for the fact that in the water, the highlights are a little bit more subtle and more gradual fall off, if you will. In the polarized image, I feel like I can see a little bit more under the water. It's not so shiny. Again, here, look in the foreground. It has a sort of feathered effect in the non-polarized image, where the polarized image, I feel like I can see under the water texture a little bit more. So overall, still very, very good. So there you have it. I'll let you decide for yourself which you like more. I think certain situations lend themselves better to certain types of images. For example, if you didn't have a tripod, or you forgot to bring your filters and you still wanted that smooth effect, maybe you can handhold your camera and take multiple short exposure images and then later combine them in Photoshop using the auto align feature and then stacking them as I showed you here. If you do have a polarizer and ND filter, certainly use them. I think you get a different and maybe somewhat better effect if you have a polarizer, and if you have a polarizer ND combo, that's the best situation of all, because you have both the effect of the long exposure and minimized glare with the polarizer effect. Okay, so now this is the final edited version of the image. I hope you enjoy it. I tuned the contrast and color saturation, a little bit of the curves a bit, and a little bit of clarity to get this final look. I think it works well for this type of image. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask them in the comments section. Also, please remember to like and subscribe to this content if you want to see more.